with market fluctuation in commodities and the drought expanding in the United States. Jerry Gidel is going to follow us with that and share a lot of his thoughts right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. So Jerry, how are you today? So it seems that was a wild week again.
Oh, it was. We basically, since the crop report in May here, we've been on the defensive. And then, earlier in the week, we kind of chopped back and forth. And then midweek, the rumors got flying about the fact that the Chinese might have canceled some old crop corn or maybe rolled a big bunch of it to new crop and things like that. The market was a little vulnerable. It took out Tuesday's low. Then it took out last week's low, and then boom, boom, boom. We slammed it right down there on Wednesday. From that standpoint, didn't get all the way down to some magic numbers, but got pretty defensive. Then Tuesday, the export sales themselves, Thursday, when the export sales came through, they actually were quite impressive. They maybe are a little less than some people are looking for in the corn, but it's still 225 million bushels of corn, second largest in one day that we had. The last one was back there in January 28th and that. And so, but the market was on a defensive tone. It had actually weakened up overnight, and actually it went down and tested the July values at $6 and the new crop December at $5, and even beans on the took out the $15 spot on nearby July down to $14.90 and that. But those statistics, along with some little higher old crop corn purchases of about 20 million, some numbers in soybeans that were a little better than expected, and that all of a sudden we got this market kind of holding together a little bit as we went into the value there. And then interestingly enough, by the time we got to later on Thursday there, we found this market rebounding pretty aggressively, partly because of the fact that we kind of washed out some investors here, and it hit some important technical and psychological numbers, and then had a bounce back. A little bit of a profit taking going into the long weekend here in the U.S. We have a 3-day holiday, so people decide, not unusual, they'll decide, okay, either the longs took some profits or the shorts decided not to, there wasn't any reason to get out of their position. So we have that type of scenario going into things. When we get back to trading on Monday night, it'll be quite interesting to see how things start moving in that direction here on that. But there's definitely a wild one that this week came through on things because of the, at this point, the vulnerability of the chart patterns really kind of set us in a kind of defensive tone, but maybe we've turned things around here after finding these big psychological numbers being supportive.
Yes, and right now, nearly 25% of the U.S. corn is considered under drought. That's the same drought that it was in the West only in earlier in the year, but now it seems it's expanding.
Definitely, and as we've kind of talked about over the last month or so, it's really been becoming quite a factor there in the Dakotas, both South and North Dakota. It's also strung along across northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and Michigan. Also being impacted as it's went across here. And so the impact of this is subtle because in the spring you don't really sense that, the key thing is more warmth to get the crop out of the ground and things like that. The interesting thing about it is that the subsoil moisture here in the area that's talked about in drought areas, that was quite significant once you get past the Rocky Mountains and go all the way to the West Coast, in that the subsoil moisture in what we just described, and even in other parts of Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, not great in that. So I think it's going to be catching people's eye here, and it's definitely it was one of those features that kind of pop up today a little bit on people's radar, that we could still have that kind of issues out there. Yeah, I've had some rains. Central Illinois had some rains, Missouri, parts of Iowa. Indiana, Ohio have been a little dry, but they've got some recent rains. So everybody's felt they're dandy. Everything's in great shape. But the problem we have is that last year's sneaky drought that came in August through October was built because we had limited subsoil moisture that got even worse. So maybe we've got the same problem staring us in the face here going forward. But right now, we're going to be looking at some other statistics here. We're not going to get the big number everybody wants to know, though, about plantings until June 30th. But we do have a USDA report later in June here.
Yes, and another thing impacting corn is the new Safras and Mercado forecast putting the Brazilian output at 95 million metric tons.
Yeah, all of a sudden, the old gray lady in South American consultancies jumped into the pot here and moved their number down from 104 down to, you said, 95. That's a kind of a number that's been around here from other agencies and ideas. That's where we're at from our friends at ConAb yet. They'll probably get down there too in June. And the USDA is 102. So we've got a lot of the interesting thing about that is I know that a lot of that was also involved with people's attitudes earlier in the month. But it's always interesting when the physical number actually shows up on a report and confirm some of the ideas that are floating around. And interestingly enough, the weather situation that's going across, or continuing, I should say, in Brazil is still some issues there. Parts of Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, southern Goiás, and that definitely an area where there's a lot of double crop corn, there's safrinha corn out there, and even Mato Grosso, there's some areas that has had some rain, but I don't know, it's going to be quite interesting. The interesting also thing that kind of announced today, along with things from Safras Mercado, was that the Brazilian government put out kind of an ominous statement that the nation of Brazil was in its worst droughts in 91 years. That's an interesting statement when you go into the dry season, which isn't traditionally, let's just make a quick analysis, June 1 to September 1, there's not a lot of rain. Maybe you get some in Rio Grande do Sul, maybe you get a little bit in Paraná, but in general, there's limited rains that happen from June 1 to September 1 that's wintertime. So it's the dry season in South America. And so, that's what we've talked before. Interestingly enough, once the rains start to retreat back into the Amazon or go down into Argentina, and it's quite a battle to get some rains into the heart of some of these grain areas in the west central Brazil.
Yes, and next week we are going to start a new month, and it seems there will be more driving there in the U.S.
Yeah. Psychologically, the markets are going to be now looking at crop conditions, things like that. The one twist we had last week was that people were looking for some slight improvement in the wheat conditions, and instead they winter wheat went down, and the spring wheat numbers up there in the northern plains came in 5 to 7 bushels, or 5 to 7 points lower in the good and excellent than expected. I think there's some optimism about corn and bean ratings, but we don't want to forget about that 25% that's not going to look good out there, and that's going to hold back some of those numbers. The other thing we get here is a kind of recap of some of the other important domestic numbers that the U.S. comes up with on Tuesday afternoon. We'll be looking at what our U.S. crush will be for the month of April. The trade gas is right around 171 million, ranges from 170 to 173 million. That's down from last year. It's backed into the number we had from NOPA back in April here. It's a little surprising about that number being off, but definitely a tight situation here in the U.S. and that the recent setback in prices and things like that, maybe that's going to create a little more supplies and things like that for them to get more fired up on and domestic crush. It's going to be watched closely, though. The number we get for the month of May here, when we've had the reactions in the prices, we'll see how that U.S. crush pops up there. But that's going to be watched closely. And that the other number, of course, is the monthly ethanol output. And that if you remember, March of last year was the tipping point on the U.S. And by the end of the month, we were virtually shut down and like 50 or 40% down on our capacity of output. And that this year hung in there, that type of thing, definitely stronger. We're looking for 414 to 420 million bushels being used. We used about 420 million last in the comparison to during March. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that number comes through. But those two things will be important to kind of look at things as we look into the June USDA numbers, which will be issued on June 10th. That's basically just 1 day short of 2 weeks from now.
Yes, we have covered a lot of corn in this episode, but we have to talk a little bit at least about soybeans. So,
yes.
Yeah, we seem to have a calmer week because we didn't have a lot of news regarding the other oils.
Yes. Yeah, the bean oil market has been quite raucous in that back and forth. There's been concerns about India and their health issues, and maybe they're going to cut back on importing soybean oil because they are the number one user of soybeans. They create a lot of soybeans themselves and use it. It's along with palm oil. Palm oil is also a big. Their whole world of eating has a lot of veg oils involved. Same thing with China. Those two are substantial users of veg oils around the world, and back and forth, we've had some ups and downs. We actually slipped down to and found some support on an uptrend line here about Thursday too. From there, the meal side of things continues to be somewhat of a drag here, partly because we're seasonally this time of year, we tend to start to slow down a little bit. But I think the oil side of this thing continues to be a strong point. And so we're actually kind of looking around, finding places that we might want to sell soybean meal. And that the one interesting twist about it is that Argentina at this point still has not been as strong of a world supplier of soybean meal as they have been in the past. And that might give the U.S. a little bit of an opportunity to be a bigger exporter here. Going forward, it looks like a lot of the producers down there, as they have done over the years, have decided to hold their soybeans. They sold some, of course, on this rally, but at the same time, they're because of the inflation issues or currency problems down there, a lot of people continue to hold their soybeans as their hedge against inflation and a weaker peso in Argentina. So that's a feature. The soybeans at this scenario, it's kind of got lost, like you said, primarily because the fact that the Brazilian exports of soybeans have been moving through, but that's interestingly enough going to slow down here pretty quickly here. Not so much this week, but probably by early July, there's not going to be a lot of extra soybeans floating around out there. And so that's why this is going to be quite an interesting transition between South America and North America on supplying the world with soybeans as we go forward.
Yes, and what are you seeing on the wheat side of things?
Well, the wheat market in the U.S. has still been kind of hobbled here by the big the big number that the Kansas Wheat Tour came up with. But the interesting twist that's really set in front of us here, and part of the reason why this market was also weak mid to late week here was that there was a big forecast of a substantial rain going from Texas all the way up to Nebraska, and that which is really handles the three big hard red wheat states. And that the twist of it is that at this time of year we want to harvest. We don't want a whole bunch of rain. And particularly, it has been raining in Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of Kansas already. And so some of the grounds are saturated already. And the twist of it is that is actually something that could create a disease that attacks the heads. It's called wheat scab. There's a more fancy name for it. I'm always tough to pronounce it. So, but it's something that happens from the humidity, and it comes and it attacks the heads, and all of a sudden your weight of the heads on the wheat plant turn out to be a lot less. So that's a real fear in this thing. There's been forecasts of that maybe impacted and that as we go right into harvest. So it looks like it's good, but it couldn't be. There's other things floating around out here. The one twist of it is our friends in the Black Sea and primarily Russia have decided to all of a sudden back off on their tariff they put out. They issued one starting back in February. They adjusted it higher as we went through the spring. Now they have a more automated type of determination for their tariff, and that the euro dollar was that they said originally was 50 is now going to be 28, and so there's lots of indications that maybe there's going to be a little bit more competition from Russia in the world markets here. They're a major supplier to Egypt and the Mideast and things like that. So we'll be watching their production out that direction too. From there, there's some talk that there's going to be some decent rains going through the Black Sea area over the next 2 weeks, and that which is a positive. They're still a few days away from harvest, but just like here, they don't want to have rains continuing into late June and then July, or in our case, for the next couple of weeks here in Texas and Oklahoma. Those people traditionally are harvesting their wheat starting through the first half of June.
Well, I think we covered everything at this time. Thank you, Jerry.
You bet, sir. And at this point, let's hope we can get a little stability in this market for next week. I think we've found a little bit of technical things to lean on. Let's hope we can find some other unusualness. Watching that U.S. weather here could be quite a factor. Sometimes too much rain can be just as bad as not enough. So we got everything going here.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good day.